Before we get started with this, welcome to winter, by the way. I know at least one person in here is from Minnesota, upper Minnesota, and it's like -2 degrees up there right now. It's not here. This painting will be sold tonight. This is a John Fawcett painting he brought. It'll be sold tonight the same way that the paintings on the wall are sold. We've got a sign-up sheet, and at the end, maybe 20 minutes after the program's over tonight, we'll do a random number draw of the people who signed up. But it's your opportunity. First of all, how many people do not own a John Fawcett? So this is your opportunity. This is your opportunity. It's a beautiful painting. Beautiful painting. So that's, or if you want multiple, so that's a great thing. Also, how many artists do we have here tonight? If you just raise your hands, if you're an artist, please give them a round of applause. After we're done tonight, please go talk to them. They may not want to talk to you, but I can guarantee you, if you ask them about their art, it may be midnight before you get out of here. Talk to them about their art. If they have a piece in the show, get them to explain it to you. Use this opportunity to learn about Western art and our wonderful artists who are here and contributing. Our speaker tonight is no stranger to this area. He was elected as an MO artist in 1997 and an FWA Artist of the Year in 2008. He's participated in all the art shows since, and I think maybe all but one has sold a painting, so very successful. Outside of painting, he's on 2 board of directors of art museums, one in Steamboat, one in Brandywine, Pennsylvania. The one in Brandywine, Pennsylvania is the home museum for N.C. Wyeth. He gives back to the art community with painting and horse anatomy classes. I don't know if you've got your picture tonight in your presentation of the black horse with the bones on it. It's one of my favorite. He and Elizabeth, his wife, here, have Labradors and raised quarter horses split between Colorado and Pennsylvania. One of the characteristics we all prize is authenticity. John was born to horses in Iowa and received his doctorate of veterinary medicine from Iowa State and practiced big animal vet work for more than 20 years. So I think he knows the insides and outsides of the horse. He did this for 20 years before giving into a passion to do painting. And I'm sure tonight he'll talk about his early memories of painting and when he decided to give up vet work and become an artist. So he follows in the great footsteps of the greats, the Russells, the Remingtons, N.C. Wyeth, Olaf Weghorst. And he's doing as they did. He's painting what he knows. So please extend a warm friend's welcome to John Fawcett.
Okay. So, as you said, my talk tonight is Horse Sense, Paint What You Know. And when Helen called me to ask if I would speak tonight, I thought, well, what would people like to hear? And so I thought I would speak on what interests me, which is with other artists. Why they paint what they do, and how did they become an artist, because that's what really, and I'll show you some examples tonight of artists that I admire and show some images of their work and talk about how successful they were. So my talk is about the artist tonight, not only the artist, but the art enthusiast and the collector, which you all are, and the passion of both the artist and the art enthusiast. And a lot of people have no idea how an artist does their work. You know, do they just come up with, friends of mine, they say, well, you just get inspired someday and go into your studio and and just paint beautiful paintings. Now it's a little more than that, as I'll try to show you. But you know, why do they paint what they do, and did they have another career as I did, and many of them, as you'll see, do. What were their influences? You know, what medium did they paint in, and what's the story behind the painting? And I think, as you'll see tonight with a lot of my work, there is some kind of story behind the painting. That's what draws me to certain paintings. Do they paint in the studio? Do they paint plein air outside? What is their painting schedule? And if some of you have heard this talk before, I apologize. You can go into the bar right now. But this is some of my disclaimers here. So I grew up in Iowa, and I hope that you all don't think that I am like is portrayed here in Grant Wood's American Gothic, which happens to be his spinster sister and his dentist. And I put this in not only because Grant Wood was from Iowa, but he was from Cedar Rapids, where I grew up. And he was a teacher there in Cedar Rapids and in Stone City, and he painted in the garage above Turner's Mortuary on First Avenue, and I visited this studio many times. This is another kind of favorite image that I came across that I wanted to include because it's Norman Rockwell, and I'm sure all of you have seen Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms. This one, I think, is appropriate right now because the Cedar Rapids Gazette in the Lynn County voting machine says, "Which one, FDR or Dewey?" But he was a storyteller, and again, that really drew me to Norman Rockwell. This is a sketch, a drawing that I did when I was 4 years old. And Elizabeth found this, I think, somewhere. And my mom had written on the back of this, "All Johnny wants to do is play cowboys and Indians and draw." And Elizabeth says I haven't changed very much in all this. So I shared a bedroom with my older brother Rob, and there were a lot of classics on the bookshelves. And they were Last of the Mohicans, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and they all had in common that they were illustrated by one of my heroes now, N.C. Wyeth. Okay? And my brother read all the books, and I just looked at the pictures. But I had one of my good friends growing up was lived down the street from me, and his father was an artist. And I loved to go over to his house, and we'd sneak into his dad's studio when he had another job, and we'd sneak into the studio, and I'd love to look around at what he was doing in the canvases and the brushes and the paint. I was just enthralled with that. I loved animals and was surrounded by them growing up. This is a picture of my father and me where we would vacation at a dude ranch in Colorado. And I still remember my horse that I rode at that time. Her name was Sweetheart. And I can't remember what I had for dinner last night. So the mind is a curious thing. But I bought my first horse when I was 10 years old, and I loved spending time at the barn with my buddies and riding horses and going bareback, and we had a great time. And a recurrent theme throughout my childhood was both art and animals. This was a picture of when I was 16. My dad took me on a pack trip with horses up in the Rockies, and we had a great time. And I always was drawing growing up. I worked for the student newspaper, did caricatures. I worked for the yearbooks. I used to remember drawing pictures of characters of my professors and teachers in class and passing them around to make kids laugh. And I always thought art as a hobby I thought of it as a avocation rather than a vocation. And my parents were very supportive of what I wanted to do, but I ended up going to veterinary school after I graduated from college at Iowa State. And then I worked at a practice right when I got out of veterinary school, and then I had the opportunity to open my own practice in 1980. Boy, I look young there. Yeah. So initially I was painting on my days off and weekends and so forth. And it was, again, a hobby, a way as a release to me. And what did I paint? I paint what I knew. This is one of our horses with one of my employees. And I continued to paint what I knew. And just, again, had it as a hobby. And my life changed in 1990 when we came out to visit my sister-in-law and her family in Tucson for Thanksgiving. And we came, they're members of the MO Club, and they brought us to the MO show. And I walked around and I thought, oh my goodness, this is crazy. I love this. I knew nothing about the contemporary Western artists. I knew about Remington and Russell, but I knew nothing about these people that are on the walls here. And so my wife and her sister said, we ought to apply to that show. So I did the next year, and I still remember going to my mailbox. I got this letter from the MO Club, and I was accepted at the show. I was really excited. So I did a painting, and we came out to the show that year, and I saw my painting on the wall, and you don't know what a feeling that is, especially when somebody that has another career, okay? And to see my painting on the wall, and then it sold, and I thought, oh my God, this is like crazy. This is so cool. And then I found out that my mother bought the painting. God bless her. So, this was kind of the start of my art career. And so I got in another show, invitational show, and I got in a gallery here in Tucson, and I got in another gallery somewhere, and I was painting on my days off and weekends, and I continued to paint what I was interested in and what I knew, people and places in Pennsylvania, but I was really interested in Western art. This is a Mennonite girl that was a neighbor of ours in Pennsylvania. And by that time, several years went by, and I met several different artists, some of them here at the MO show, and all of them said to me, you need to paint full time. You're not going to get better and better and better unless you put everything into it. So I was having a hard time of this. I was climbing the ladder of success in my veterinary career, but my ladder was leaning up against the wrong wall. So I was having a real hard time with this. I had, there were 5 veterinarians in my practice, and I had a successful career. And so I went to my stepfather, who was just retired as a physician, and I said, Dean, am I crazy? What am I doing here? I think about painting all the time, and I don't want to throw away this career that I have. And he said, well, when you're doing art, do you think about veterinary medicine? And I said, no. And he said, when you're doing surgery, do you think about art? And I said, yeah. He said, there's your answer right there. So I was fortunate enough to, within maybe 6 months of that conversation, I sold my practice, and with the blessings of Elizabeth, God bless her, I figured my biggest regret would be to not take action and to fail than not taking any action at all. So I was worried about my employees. I was worried about the clients that I had in my practice. I wanted them taken care of. They meant a lot to me over the years. And so I continued to work a little bit part-time for a few years, kept my license because I heard that Tammy Wynette kept her beautician's license even after she was a hit country star. So a lot of people said, oh, don't you miss your practice? No, I didn't miss my practice at all. I'm not getting kicked, bitten, stomped on, run over, whatever. So I remember I was feeling guilty at first. I'd go up to my studio every day and I'd turn the music on. I'd have my dogs laying on the couch with me. I'd look through art books, research books, and I'd start to paint. And I was having such a good time and the hours just flew by. And I thought, well, this is so much fun, it just can't be work. But it is work, and I was fortunate enough to meet some wonderful artists along the way, many of them here in Tucson that I call close friends. I met Jim Bam, and many of you probably have heard of Jim. He was a illustrator with Howard Turpning and so many other illustrators, Don Crowley in New York City. And he met his wife and wanted to move out west, so he moved to Wapiti, Wyoming. And I met him one day in the gallery in Cody, and he said, do you have my book? And I said, no, I don't, sir. And he said, well, let's go get my book. You can buy the book, and then I want to write in it. And I still have the book today, and it says, do it. So I really miss Jim. He passed away this last April. He was a wonderful friend and a wonderful artist. So how did my veterinary career help me? It helped me because it was probably the world's longest anatomy lesson. And since I was around animals, especially horses and dogs, all my life, it really introduced me to the correct anatomy, but not only that, the prick of the ear of the horse, how they hold their tail, how they hold their head, their eyes, what they're looking at, and I tried to incorporate that into my work. Plus, my veterinary career gave me a good business sense, I think, and it gave me a lot of dedication and discipline as well. So now what? Okay, this is what all of us artists, some of the artists here, face a blank canvas. I had the discipline, I had the blessing of Elizabeth, and I had the determination, but now I just needed thousands of hours with my paintbrush, and that's really what it takes. I needed to learn about warm and cool colors, I needed to learn about edges, I needed to learn about color theory. There was so much I needed to learn, and there was just, it seemed like an infinite amount of things that I needed to get under my belt before I would get better. So I started out in watercolors, as many of you know, and the reason I did that was because that's the medium I was familiar with growing up. You didn't need many materials, you just needed paper, pigment, and water and brushes, and you were all set. And I liked the way they looked. I liked the luminosity. I liked the so-called happy accidents most of the time. So I'll show you, this is kind of how I start some of my watercolor paint, or all of my watercolor paintings. I take paper, get it wet, staple it to a board, and then once it's dry in the sun, that waviness goes away and you have a flat piece of paper on the board. Then I do my drawing, and it's fairly detailed drawing, and then I start laying in washes. In watercolors you go from the looseness to the more tight work. So this is kind of a progression you'll see, adding more detail, and then at the very end you do dry brush, or you can do dry brush, which is getting pigment on your brush and squeezing the water out, and then you can get very fine detail. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I want to tell you about some of my influences, and with artists, and they all have a couple things in common. One is they did watercolors and another medium, and they all painted what they knew. And this is the first really most wonderful watercolor artist, I think, Winslow Homer. He was born in 1836, and he started watercolors in his 30s and did over 700 watercolors in his life. And he did a lot of illustration and book work, and he wanted to be more of a fine artist. So he used the sale of these watercolors, which he sold for $30 to $50 a piece, if you can imagine, to finance getting into larger oil paintings. And he painted in Florida and Cuba, the Bahamas, Bermuda, England, France, the Adirondacks in New York, and then he wound up in Prouts Neck, Maine, where he ended up dying. But he loved watercolors, he loved the luminosity of them, and at his death in 1910, he held the record for the highest priced watercolor sold at the time, which was $2,200, you can imagine. Do you know how much a Winslow Homer watercolor is worth today? Anyway, it really gained watercolor acceptance as a final medium in fine art rather than just a sketch, which they all were before. He loved their quality of light and their atmosphere, and he changed compositions frequently. And this is another example of an artist I really admire, John Singer Sargent. And John Singer Sargent was born in 1856, and he was raised by expatriate parents. He was born in Florence, Italy, and the family spent summers in the Alps, in the Swiss Alps, and they spent winters in Venice. And he went to school in Paris under the tutelage of Carlos Duran, and this watercolor, believe it or not, was when he was 14 years old. He thought watercolors were a joy to do. He called them emergencies, and he didn't want the grand scheme of things. He just used them as sketches, a glimpse in time. He did them very quickly. And then he got into his money-making part of his art was portraits of the aristocracy. And he did these starting in about 1890. And this is one of the most famous ones called Madame Gautreau, Madame X. He entered this in the Paris Salon in the early 1900s, and he had to repaint it. The first painting he did was her right shoulder strap was over her shoulder there on her arm, and the French press panned that, and he got so depressed he painted it up over her shoulder, and he quit painting for 6 months after that. He was so depressed. But he painted in England, he painted in France. This is a wonderful painting of his on Route pour la Pêche in Cancale, France. This is a watercolor he did of his sister Violet and his niece Emily. He loved painting plein air up in the Alps, and he gave them as gifts, and he never wanted to sell a watercolor. But in 1905, the Brooklyn Museum of Art talked him into a watercolor show at Noddler Gallery in New York City. And he said, "I'll do it if someone buys all the watercolors in one fell swoop." So the Brooklyn Museum of Art bought all those watercolors for $241 a piece, 85 watercolors. And he was pleased with that, so 3 years later, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston got jealous of the other museum, and so they said, "Well, we want to buy all of your 45 watercolors in this show," and they paid $241 a piece. Do you know what a John Singer Sargent watercolor is worth today? Anyway, I had a chance to visit with his nephew, great-nephew, Richard Ormond, at a talk he gave in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery, and that was a real highlight of my career. So the dream of ours was to move out west, and Elizabeth and I both had roots in Colorado. We both worked there for a period in college, and we were both drawn to Colorado. So we built a home there in 1996, and some of you people in the audience have been there, and we call it the Double L Ranch. And we love it there. We spend about 6 months of the year there. This is us riding there. Many of our friends are subject. This is a view on our land looking out. And I've had the opportunity to go to several very large ranches all over the West. This is a watercolor I did from the Bell Ranch, a large 292,000 acre ranch in New Mexico, where a lot of different artists have painted there. And it's important for me, being a veterinarian, to not only portray the horse correctly, but portray the cowboy and his rigging correctly as well. Because they'll call you out on it if you don't have it right. And the horse is such an integral part of the cowboy's life. I want to stress the relationship with their horse. This is a neighbor of ours, Ray Hyde. And I want to give a glimpse of ranch life today, which sometimes hasn't changed in several generations. This is my painting for the MO show that's out in the corridor here today. Sometimes I'll do a vignette watercolor because I just want to show the action and the relationship with the horse. And sometimes I want to show the camaraderie of the cowboys. This is a piece that's at Settlers West for their show this weekend. I want the viewer to become a part of the scene. I want them to hear the hoofbeats and feel the dust. So this is another example of how I start a watercolor. Stretch my board, paper on the board, start the drawing, then start laying in washes. I skip all over in watercolors, and that's the finished painting. And this was on the recent cover of Art of the West, which had an article on my studio just recently. So how do I get a idea for a painting? There's several different ways. One is research, whether it's cowboy, contemporary cowboy, and talking to ranchers, or historical cowboys. I have Indian models that I use, and sometimes it's talking to them and researching certain ceremonies, and sometimes it's actually looking at other artists' paintings and getting my own idea from that. This is the first part of that, talking with my Indian models, and what happened was, I'm directing a scene here with them. I do a lot of photography, and then this is called the moccasin trade. This is from that photo shoot I was with, my Indian models. What happened was the settlers would come out west and their leather shoes and boots didn't hold up and they were uncomfortable, so they would trade actually moccasins with the Indians. So here they're trading blankets and cloth for moccasins. So again, there's a story behind every painting. I want to be sure to get the clothing for the time period right. If it's a certain Indian tribe, I want to make sure I have the beadwork and clothing and tack of their horses correct, because it's very important to tell different tribes apart. The horses were in North America about 10,000 years ago, but then Cortez in the 1500s brought them and introduced them to the Indians, and the Indians at first were scared of them. They thought they were big dogs, and little did they know that the horses would change their way of life. The nomadic way of life became more prevalent. The way they hunted buffalo and so forth was much more easily done then. And they incorporated them into their culture extensively. And the Nez Perce were the ones that started the Appaloosa breed in the area, which is now Washington and Idaho. And these are just some examples. Again, this is another influence of mine. This is an artist, watercolor. This is Anders Zorn. He was a Swedish artist, and he did only watercolors at first until he was in his 30s. And when he was 19, he went to the Stockholm Art Academy, and he dropped out after a couple years. But his watercolors were very soft and just beautiful. And he painted what he knew. He painted all the townspeople and models that he knew that would get to model for him. This is in a brewery. Both of his parents worked in a brewery. So the transition of mine from watercolor to oil happened about 20 years ago. And I took some workshops with people, and I just asked a lot of questions. What kind of brushes do you use? What's your palette? What kind of, do you use stretch canvas or linen? How did you do it all? And basically it amounted to a lot of trial and error and thousands of hours in the studio. So a lot of people say to me, what determines if you do a watercolor or an oil? And I can look at a scene or a photograph and say, oh, this would be a great watercolor, this would be a great oil, hopefully. And here I was just interested in the story. This is a vignette. Obviously, a brave was just returning from a successful battle and was getting congratulated. So the background didn't matter a lot. Here, the background in the foreground mattered more to me because there was something awry in the pebbles that this Indian saw. So which do I like better? I love the fluidness and the luminosity of watercolors and those happy accidents, hopefully. Oils, that thick impasto and the richness of color, you can't really duplicate with watercolors. So I like both of them, really. So how do I start an oil? And this is kind of a thumbnail sketch that I did of an idea that I had called the Chief's Flag. What happened was in 1804, Lewis and Clark would give these special flags to the party to give to Indian chiefs along the way as gifts. So I thought, well, this would be a great painting. So I had my models, and this is just a progression from a burnt sienna color, which I'll show continually throughout my oils, to adding more and more color in, and you can see more and more color, and that's the finished painting. And this painting is now in the James Museum of Western Art in Tampa, Florida. Again, you can't see it very well here, but I draw my oil in and spray fixative on it with pencil, and then I do this burnt sienna wash, and this gives me all the lightest lights and the darkest darks, and I can change the composition, or if a horse's leg is too short or long, I can change it at this stage a lot easier than after I put a whole bunch of paint on and then have to scrape it off. And this is the final painting. And this is called Trading at Pierce Hole. They used to have rendezvous between the 1820s and 1840s, mostly in Wyoming and Idaho. And this area is where Jackson Hole is now, Pierce Hole. This was a painting that was purchased last year. I won the Harrison Idle-Jorg Purchase Award at the Idle-Jorg Museum. So it's in their permanent collection now. This is another blocking of an oil. Again, the progression, adding color in, adding more detail in. This is called 10 Miles to St. Joe. And the people going west in their 2,200-mile trek on the Oregon Trail didn't know that horses and mules were ill-suited to the rugged terrain, so they went to St. Joe and traded them in for oxen. And then they took oxen mostly out west. This is an idea from my Indian models. And this is called Captain Varnum, or excuse me, the Arikara Scouts. Captain Varnum was the guy in the hat there in the center. And he was in charge of the Arikara Scouts. And they were always denoted by the red sash and the loose hair. They never braided their hair. And again, sometimes I get an idea for a piece by another artist's work. And again, here's N.C. Wyeth, and that's called The Hunter. And this is a painting I did called Hunters at Dusk. And this is N.C. Wyeth's son, Andrew Wyeth, who again worked in watercolor and in egg tempera. This is called Roasted Chestnuts. And I love the tracks leading you into the painting here. So I did a painting called Wagon Tracks and Worry. And the Braves knew that when the settlers went westward and they found evidence of that their lives would be changed forever. This is a farmhouse near us in Pennsylvania where we spend part of the year. And this is why we don't spend the winter in Colorado. And that's pretty typical of Colorado winters. So we built a house and a barn in Pennsylvania, and the Amish built the barn, and it's all mortise and tenon timber frame structure. And this is where I commute to work when I'm in Pennsylvania every morning. I have no distractions up there. Elizabeth's still sleeping when I go up to the studio in the morning about 5 o'clock. And I take my dogs up there and I feed the horses and clean them, and then I go up to work. That was my wife's framing area there. She does all my watercolor matting and framing. I have Native American artifacts hanging around the studio, and a lot of these I use with my Native American models as well. And this is a view, a watercolor I did of the view looking north out of my studio towards the Appalachian Mountains. We're near Gettysburg and not too far from the Brandywine Museum, which, as Hugh said, that I go there often, and it stimulates my curiosity and everything that I want to do about my art. And this is a piece called Nation Makers. This is by Howard Pyle. And I threw this in here because Howard Pyle had a school in Wilmington, Delaware, and he taught both imagination is important to artists and also living what they wanted to paint. So he taught several great artists, Harvey Dunn, Frank Schoonover, and my hero, N.C. Wyeth, and he told them all to go live what they wanted to do. So N.C. Wyeth actually came out west in 1904 and 1905 and delivered mail in New Mexico and worked on some ranches to do some, to get his cowboy experience. And this is a view from Treasure Island that he did. And he did 17 illustrations for Scribner's for Treasure Island. And with the $2,500 he was paid, he bought 18 acres of land in Chad's Ford, which is where his house and studio and the Brandywine Museum is now. This is one of his Western works called Bronc-Buster, and this is at the Autry Museum. And this is called Hands Up. This is one of the illustrations he did from out west. And N.C. never really believed that he was a true fine artist. He always thought he was an illustrator. Well, this painting a couple years ago sold for $4.9 million. And this is some views of his studio in Chad's Ford. It's a wonderful place to visit. Everybody can go there, and they give tours from like April through October. And it was left just the way he left it. He was killed he was run over in his car on the train tracks in Chadds Ford, and unfortunately he had his grandson with him. And he had 5 children, and 3 of them were artists. And I know you've heard of them. Andrew was the youngest. He was born in 1917, and he was a big influence on my work. And Elizabeth and I had a chance to meet him, and he was really a great guy. And he wrote me a letter after our meeting, and I have it framed. Elizabeth framed it, and I have it hanging on my studio wall. He thought watercolors expressed the freeness in him, and he was trying to control something that was uncontrollable, he said. And he painted what he knew. He walked around the fields and the farmland around Chadds Ford. This is a view of his father's studio. And his father said, "Andrew, your work will never sell. It's not dramatic enough, and it doesn't have enough color." Because he was fairly monochromatic. Well, when he was 19 years old, he had a sellout show in New York City at his first gallery. And this is where he painted. This is where Andrew painted. This is where Andrew and his wife Betsy raised their 2 sons, Nicky and Jamie. Block there. Anyway, he raised the sons there, and he painted there as well. And that's where he painted over 200 works of Helga in secret over a period of 14 years. And that was quite a scandal back in the 70s. It was on the cover of Time magazine. This is a view of his soldier collection. It just so happens that I have a soldier collection too. Not quite as big as Andrew's. These are views of his studio. And he painted not only in watercolor, but as I said, egg tempera, which is mixing egg yolk and pigment. And it's a very time-taking process, and it's very labor intensive. But he painted mundane things all around his community. And this is the way he had his studio. His dog would walk in there and walk all over his sketches. He only painted in natural light. He didn't paint at night or early in the morning at all. And his one son, Jamie, of course, he went to school until the 6th grade, and then he was taught by Andrew's sister, Caroline. And this is a portrait of JFK he did when he was 19 years old. And supposedly the Kennedy family didn't like it, but I think it's pretty special. And animals are in a lot of his works too. And we had the privilege of having dinner with Jamie, and he's a great guy. This brings us to some of my equine work. And again, the anatomy helps me with that. One of the first people to change the way horses were painted is George Stubbs, and this was back in the 1700s. And the reason he changed it, horses were really painted flat in those days, and the musculature and everything, if you look at some of the old horse paintings, was not correct at all. Well, he dissected a horse, and he had all the muscles and ligaments and bone structure, and he wrote a book on it, and he really changed the way horses were painted with their anatomy correct. This is a painting he did called Whistle Jacket. It's a life-size painting. We saw it when it was on display in Baltimore, and it was huge, and he did that for King George. And he painted what he knew, basically, again. So I've tried to give back, as you said, to some of the, like some of the people that have helped me, and I've given several horse painting workshops, basically not only teaching the edges and the values and color theory and so forth, but also anatomical measurements and bone structure. And that's my wife's horse Aubrey, who she got from Wendy here, who's 28 years old now.
Wow.
And I'm doing some measurements with twine. There's, just like in the human body, there are certain measurements in animals that work out no matter if it's a pony or a draft horse. And I try to stress that in classes so that I show people how the correct measurements are so very important. And I've been fortunate to be able to do some thoroughbred work. And this is called Two Champions. This is a watercolor of Forever Together and Informed Decision for a client that lives in Pennsylvania. And he also wanted me to do a portrait of a champion of his called Moonlight Cloud, who was in Ireland. So we went to Ireland to Coolmore Stud. And Coolmore is the world's largest thoroughbred farm. And they have farms in the United States, in Ireland, and Australia. And it was a beautiful place. And we got there, and we planned this trip, and they had Moonlight Cloud all brushed out and everything beautiful for me. And typical Ireland weather, it was raining the whole time and cloudy. And we got there, I started sketching, and then the sun came out for about an hour and a half, and we had beautiful light. And this is a watercolor I did of Moonlight Cloud. And again, this is an oil that I started with my block-in grisaille, they call it in French, and start adding color in once that grisaille is dry, adding more color and more color. And this is a finished painting that my clients had. So the main equine artists that influenced me, I know you're getting sick of these influences, but this is Sir Alfred Munnings. And Alfred Munnings was born in 1878, and he went to school in England, and he was around horses all his life and owned many, many horses. He loved horses, and he painted what he knew. This is a gypsy boy that he befriended and painted many, many paintings of called Shrimp. And he was a great colorist and knew horses inside and out. He only had vision in one eye. When he was about 20 years old, he was reaching for one of his dogs over a hedge and got poked in the eye with a thorn. So he did amazing work for being blind in one eye. He really is, and you can go to his home. He did a lot of British sporting art, went to the racetrack a lot, did a lot of hunt scenes, commissions for aristocracy. He was hired by the Canadian Army to document World War I. But he was just a wonderful artist. This is his house called Castle House. And upon his death, and his wife's death, she left it to the National Trust in England. It's in Dedham in Suffolk. And we've been there several times. And in fact, one time we went there, and there was a gentleman at the door standing there, and we were talking about Munnings, and he said, I was a stable boy for Munnings. And so I thought, oh my goodness, that was, he was 10 years old or something. So as viewers and connoisseurs, your passion and enthusiasm is crucial. And it doesn't matter your taste, whether you like Western art or contemporary art, as long as you're enthusiastic and passionate about it. Because that's what drives me, and that's what drives other artists that are here in the room. Find out something that appeals to you and ask questions about the artist. Find out more about it. Is it just a pretty picture? Or find out why they painted what they did. Some of you may have heard about Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book. And his premise is that you needed 10,000 hours to get proficient at something. And so that's about 5 years of working 40 hours a week. But I think a recent editor of one of the art magazines said, well, you need talent too. But my premise is you need enthusiasm and passion for what you're doing. And the Greeks and the Romans, they believed in genius and demons. So that they thought, whether you were a sculptor, a painter, or a philosopher, they thought these geniuses and demons came into your studio and they took over, these fairies took over for you, and they did the work for you. They seriously believed this. And so if you had a great work of art, then you didn't really need to take credit because the fairies did it for you. But if you had a flop, it was no big deal because, you know, the demons came in and you had a bad day. But then what happened in the Renaissance period was that the man became the center of the universe, really. And it was all up to him. So that was frightening, because if you failed, it was your fault. If you had a good work, well, that was okay. But what I'm saying is you just have to put your time in, put your 10,000 hours in, and paint what you know, and just show up. And again, find out about the artist, and that'll enrich your time with the art that you have purchased or that you have hanging in your house. You want to find out what their influences were and what their story was, basically. So in closing, I really want to stress from the bottom of my heart that Tucson and the MO Club and Jack Goodman and Chris and Dave Ratliff changed our lives, and we're forever grateful. It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for just a couple questions.
I have a question.
Go.
Did you ever have any formal education, or you
No, I never took an art class at all. I took some workshops once I thought I wanted to do this to get better. Ron Riddick, I took a workshop from Ron Riddick, and who many of you know, and some other people, but no formal art training.
You're fabulous.
Thank you.
Bob?
John, what made you transition, so to speak, from watercolors to oil? After 20 years of watercolors?
I think it was just, I wanted to learn more, and I liked oil. I loved watercolors, but I wanted to learn more about how it was done. And I think, and it's not really, I think, true, but a lot of people think watercolors are less valuable. And I think it went back to some people thinking, well, they don't last as long. Well, I tell you, Elizabeth and I have seen a watercolor exhibit at the National Gallery from watercolors from the early 1700s, and they were pristine. So some people don't like things under glass. I can see that, but I just love both mediums. So I think it was just wanting to branch out and learn more and learn more and learn more.
How in the world do you do a pinstripe shirt in watercolors?
How do you do a pinstripe
Real
shirt
small
in watercolors?
brushes. Elizabeth says, I'm very patient when I paint, but I'm not very patient otherwise.
Did you use a rigger? The one hair brush for that?
Well,
Tom Hill would
they're
use
pretty
those.
small. 4-aught brushes.
4-aught brushes. All right, one more. Last one.
I'm just kind of curious how you determine the price of your paintings.
Well, when you first start out, you have your prices low. And then if they sell, then you raise your prices a little bit. And seriously, it's based on what comparable pieces of your peers are going for, how long you've been in the business, and the galleries will direct you in that direction as well.
All right, well, let's give John a big welcome.
John, we've got a special little token gift for you from Friends of Western Art.
Oh my.
This is a very nice little pad. I wish I had one myself like that.
Thank
but
you very much.
we only get plastic ones, so this is real leather.
I appreciate that very much.
No, it's
It's been an honor.
Well, it's been an honor to have. It's been an honor to have you.